What if I told you that inside America's prisons, people are being served food crawling with maggots, and no one wants you to see it? In 2014, a shocking investigation revealed the horrifying truth about prison meals in Ohio. But this isn't just about bad food, it's about profit, power, and punishment. Before we dive in, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what you're about to see will make you question what justice really tastes like. It started with a rumor, a whisper through the steel hallways of Ohio's correctional system. They found maggots in the food line. At first, no one wanted to believe it. Maggots? In a state-run facility? Impossible. But by June 2014, the whispers had become headlines. At the Trumbull Correctional Institution, inmates and kitchen workers noticed something moving near the steam tables. When staff checked, they discovered the impossible: dozens of maggots writhing beneath food trays right next to the serving line. The kitchen was run by Aramark Correctional Services, a private food contractor hired by the state to cut costs. But what they were really cutting was corners. Over the next few weeks, reports began to pour in from multiple Ohio prisons. At Ohio Reformatory for Women, maggots were discovered in the food prep area. At Mansfield Correctional Institution, again, maggots near the serving lines. And at Ohio's Marion Correctional Institution, where over 2,500 inmates were fed daily, the infestation spread through the pipes, storage units, and drain systems. The Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction confirmed at least 7 separate incidents of maggots found in Aramark-run kitchens. But behind the press statements and sanitized reports lay a deeper crisis, one built on the quiet suffering of thousands. Inmates began describing what they were served: green hot dogs, rotten potatoes, mystery meat stew, food that was expired, undercooked, or crawling with contamination. One inmate wrote in a grievance letter, "The smell in the kitchen is unbearable. The meat has slime on it. Even the bread has mold. If we complain, we don't eat." Others said they were threatened with disciplinary action if they refused to work in the kitchen or report issues. For the people inside, it wasn't just disgusting, it was dehumanizing. When reporters pressed for answers, the state pointed to Aramark's $145 million contract, a deal supposedly meant to save taxpayers' money. But saving money meant fewer staff, cheaper ingredients, and cut safety inspections. By mid-2014, Aramark had already been fined $272,000 by the state for repeated violations, including serving food with maggots, running out of meals, and workers smuggling contraband into facilities. Yet the contract continued. Meanwhile, the maggots weren't the only problem. At Franklin Medical Center, inmates reported being served food labeled, "not for human consumption." At Chillicothe Correctional Institution, meals were prepared without gloves or hairnets, in kitchens infested with flies and roaches. By the end of the summer, the stories had spread beyond Ohio, to Michigan, Florida, and even Texas, all states using private food service giants like Aramark and Trinity Services Group. In Michigan, the same year, maggots were found in the Jackson and Macomb correctional facilities. More than 30 Aramark workers were banned from entering prisons for misconduct, including smuggling drugs and having sexual contact with inmates. And just like in Ohio, reports surfaced of moldy bread, undercooked chicken, and spoiled meat. It wasn't just negligence, it was systemic exploitation. A business model that treated food, the most basic human necessity, as a profit margin. An internal memo leaked from the Michigan Department of Corrections warned of significant performance failures by Aramark, but senior officials still hesitated to terminate the deal. Why? Because it saved millions, on paper. What the public didn't see was the human cost. Inside the chow halls, inmates described the same routine. Line up. Hold your tray. Keep your head down. Don't ask what's in the food. Don't ask if it's safe. Just eat it or go hungry. For the men and women behind bars, the message was clear. You don't deserve better. In the eyes of the system, food wasn't nourishment, it was punishment. And for Aramark, every spoiled meal was still $1 earned. But as one whistleblower would later reveal, the maggots were only the beginning of what America's private prison food industry was hiding. To understand how something as grotesque as maggots in prison food could happen again and again, we have to follow the money, and in this story the trail leads straight to the corporate boardrooms. When Ohio signed its $145 million contract with Aramark Correctional Services in 2013, officials praised it as a cost-saving measure. The promise was simple. Aramark would feed nearly 50,000 inmates across 25 state facilities for less money than the government could do it itself. But within months that promise began to rot, literally. Aramark, a Philadelphia-based food service giant, wasn't new to controversy. The company already managed cafeterias in schools, hospitals, and stadiums across the country. But prison contracts were especially profitable, because prisoners couldn't choose where or what to eat. According to public records and budget audits, the company's model relied on maximum efficiency, minimal expense, and zero accountability. That meant cutting costs on everything from ingredients to staff training. In Ohio, some Aramark kitchen workers earned as little as $1.50 per hour, supervising hundreds of inmate workers who received just a few cents for the same labor. Inspectors repeatedly found kitchens where refrigerators were malfunctioning. Expired meat sat unrefrigerated. Meals were prepared on surfaces slick with grease and grime. Cleaning supplies were scarce, or completely missing. But behind the grime was an even uglier truth. The less Aramark spent, the more profit it made. In 2014, Ohio fined Aramark over $270,000 for contract violations, but the penalties were barely a fraction of what the company earned. Instead of being a deterrent, the fines became a cost of doing business. And the same playbook was running in Michigan. In 2013, Michigan signed a $145 million, three-year deal with Aramark, nearly identical to Ohio's. Soon the same reports emerged. Maggots in the food lines at Jackson, Macomb, and Alger correctional facilities. Food shortages so severe that some inmates were forced to go hungry. And perhaps most damning, more than 200 Aramark employees fired or banned from state prisons for misconduct. In a 2015 investigative report by the Detroit Free Press, one Michigan corrections officer stated, "We'd find trays crawling with maggots and Aramark would just clean the surface and keep serving." Inmates described meat labeled for animal consumption only being cooked and served. Vegetables pulled from trash bins and reused, and portions so small that fights broke out in dining halls daily. Public outrage grew, but the contracts didn't stop. Why? Because Aramark, and other private contractors like Trinity Services Group, had deep political ties. Aramark's political donations, both direct and through subsidiaries, reached hundreds of thousands of dollars across multiple states. They sponsored conferences, funded campaign events, and hired powerful lobbyists to keep the contracts alive. In Ohio, they even employed a former Department of Rehabilitation official as a consultant, raising major conflict of interest questions. When reporters tried to dig deeper, Aramark responded with carefully worded statements denying systemic issues, calling incidents isolated and exaggerated. But behind closed doors, internal memos painted a different picture. "We are understaffed at multiple facilities. Food safety protocols are not being followed. Quality is secondary to output." These weren't isolated cases. They were symptoms of a system designed to dehumanize and profit from it. A former Aramark kitchen worker in Michigan told Vice News in 2016, "They treated us and the inmates the same way, disposable. If something spoiled, they just mixed it with sauce and kept serving. I quit after I saw maggots in the meatloaf mix." The public would never accept such conditions in schools or hospitals. But in prisons? It was hidden behind walls, paperwork, and indifference. Out of sight, out of mind. By 2015, Michigan had finally had enough, at least on paper. The state terminated Aramark's contract early, citing unacceptable performance and hygiene issues. But just weeks later, they replaced them with another private vendor, Trinity Services Group, a company with its own history of similar complaints. In the end, nothing really changed. The name on the trucks did. The suffering didn't. These corporate food providers operate in a space where human rights meet profit margins, and one side always loses. Inside prison kitchens, the difference between cost-cutting and cruelty is a line crossed daily, often with the approval of those paid to look the other way. And while the public saw maggots and mold as shocking headlines, inside the walls, inmates saw them as routine. As one incarcerated man in Ohio wrote in a letter to his family, "They say we're paying our debt to society. But how much debt do we owe before we're allowed to eat like humans again?" The truth is, this wasn't an accident. It was policy disguised as budget reform. But how did this cost-saving model spread from state to state so quickly, and who was really benefiting from the suffering? To answer that, we have to step back and look at how the prison food industry became a billion-dollar machine. The modern prison food industry wasn't built overnight, it was engineered quietly and deliberately over decades. At its core lies a simple equation: incarceration equals profit. And few have profited more than the corporations behind those steel kitchen doors. To understand this empire, we go back to the 1980s and 1990s, the era of the tough-on-crime movement. America's prison population exploded from fewer than 500,000 to over 2 million in just 2 decades. With cells filling faster than budgets could keep up, states began outsourcing services, from healthcare to maintenance to food. That's when companies like Aramark, Trinity Services Group and Compass Group's canteen saw an opening, a chance to turn punishment into profit. Feeding prisoners isn't glamorous. It doesn't make headlines and it doesn't win votes. But it's steady, state-funded business, immune to market crashes or economic slowdowns. If you can win one state contract, you control the daily meals of tens of thousands of people, guaranteed income, every single day. By the early 2000s, Aramark Correctional Services had contracts in over 500 correctional facilities across North America. Trinity Services Group managed meals for hundreds of thousands more. Together, these two companies would control an estimated 75% of all prison food service contracts in the United States. And the numbers were staggering. Each meal cost the state on average less than $2. But through massive volume and razor-thin budgets, companies made millions in profit. The formula was simple: reduce food quality, reduce labor costs, and maximize return. To make that possible, they relied heavily on inmate labor. In many states, incarcerated people cook, clean, and serve meals, often for as little as 23 cents an hour. They handled dangerous equipment, boiling water, and raw meat, often with minimal safety training. In return, they earn less than $1 a day, wages that would be illegal outside prison walls. In an industry analysis by Prison Policy Initiative, researchers estimated that prison labor saves contractors hundreds of millions annually, effectively allowing corporations to operate with near-zero labor cost. Meanwhile, state budgets proudly claimed taxpayer savings, ignoring the fact that those savings were extracted from human suffering. A 2018 investigation by the Marshall Project found that some states even allowed private vendors to penalize inmates who refused kitchen work, often by removing privileges like visitation or access to commissary. Refuse to cook spoiled meat? Lose your right to call your family. Refuse to clean up a maggot infestation? Spend a week in solitary. This exploitation isn't accidental, it's built into the business model. In confidential reports from Florida Department of Corrections, inspectors documented systemic violations by food contractors. Mold growing on bread and produce. Watered-down soups and sauces. Contaminated meat being reserved after complaints. Yet contracts were renewed year after year. Oh, because these corporations knew how to play the game. They donated to campaigns. They sponsored corrections conferences. They hired former prison officials as consultants, people who knew exactly how to navigate the system. By the time scandals reached the public, the damage was already buried under layers of bureaucracy. Even when exposed, the financial penalties were meaningless. When Michigan fined Aramark $270,000, the company's annual revenue topped $14 billion. That's the equivalent of a parking ticket for a billionaire. But perhaps the most chilling part of this empire is how invisible it remains. Prison kitchens are off-limits to the public, journalists, and often even legislators. There are no Yelp reviews, no customer complaints, no viral photos of moldy food trays, because phones aren't allowed and cameras are banned. When footage does leak, like the 2016 video from Alger Correctional Facility in Michigan, showing live maggots crawling in food containers, it disappears from headlines in days. The company denies responsibility. The state issues a press release. And life, or something like it, goes on behind the bars. Aramark executives, meanwhile, collect bonuses for operational efficiency. Shareholders see rising profits. And incarcerated people, human beings, are left scraping green hot dogs off trays trying not to vomit. In 2019, an internal review by Ohio auditors showed that despite public outrage, private food contracts actually increased in number, spreading to more facilities nationwide. Other corporations followed suit, turning food, healthcare, and phone calls into billion-dollar markets. Together, these privatized prison industries now generate over $80 billion a year, according to the ACLU and Prison Policy Initiative. Behind every plate of watery beans or rancid meatloaf is an ecosystem. Lobbyists, investors, and government agencies, all benefiting from keeping costs low and prisons full. The prison food industry isn't a broken system. It's a working system, working exactly as designed. A system where suffering is not a flaw but a feature. And as long as taxpayers believe it's saving money, the maggots will keep coming back. But what about the people forced to live and eat in these conditions? Their stories paint a picture darker than any corporate report could show. Behind every news headline about maggots in the food line, there are names, faces, and stomachs, real people living through the daily humiliation of being fed like animals. And when a few of them dared to speak, the system tried to silence them. It's one thing to read about contamination in a report. It's another to imagine the moment an inmate opens a tray and sees something squirming inside the mashed potatoes. In 2014, Sean Hawkins, an inmate at the Trumbull Correctional Institution in Ohio, wrote a desperate letter to his sister. The letter, later shared with reporters, described what had become a daily nightmare. The food smells like death. There are bugs in the gravy. The meat turns gray overnight. When we tell the staff, they laugh and say, "You shouldn't have come to prison." Hawkins wasn't exaggerating. In follow-up investigations by the Columbus Dispatch and NBC4, health inspectors confirmed maggots found near the serving lines, not once but multiple times. And yet, the company responsible, Aramark, denied any wrongdoing, calling it an isolated pest control issue. At Mansfield Correctional Institution, another inmate named Anthony Riddle filed grievances after discovering spoiled meat being mixed into new food. He wrote, "They told us to just stir it up and keep cooking. The smell made me sick. But we were threatened with a conduct ticket if we refused to serve it." In prison, a conduct ticket can mean loss of visits, solitary confinement, or restricted meals. So, like hundreds of others, Riddle stayed silent, because silence was safer than starvation. But not everyone stayed quiet. In Michigan, whistleblowers started coming forward, not just inmates but even Aramark employees. One of them, Patricia Johnson, worked as a kitchen supervisor at Macomb Correctional Facility. She described what she saw to the Detroit Free Press. "We didn't have enough staff. The food was old. Sometimes I'd open boxes and see mold. We were told to cut the mold off and keep going. When I complained, I got written up for disruptive behavior. Within weeks she was fired." Another Aramark employee in Jackson, Michigan, said she quit after discovering larvae in food storage containers. She recalled being told by a manager, "It's protein. Don't make a big deal out of it." For the incarcerated men and women eating that food, complaints were met with retaliation. Inmates who filed grievances were labeled troublemakers. Some were transferred to different facilities. Others were placed in segregation for their safety. In one letter obtained by the Marshall Project, an inmate at Chillicothe Correctional Institution wrote, "They say maggots don't kill you. But hunger does. When we protest, they take away commissary. So we stop talking. We just stop eating." For those with chronic illnesses, diabetes, heart conditions, or weakened immune systems, the spoiled food wasn't just degrading, it was deadly. Several lawsuits alleged severe food poisoning, weight loss, and infections linked to contaminated meals. But because prisoners are classified as wards of the state, they often lacked the legal power or representation to pursue justice. And while inmates suffered, the profits grew. Every uneaten tray, every reused batch of stew, every adjusted ingredient translated to higher margins for the contractor. It was efficiency at its most grotesque. When Vice News interviewed a former Aramark regional manager in 2017, he admitted off camera, "The problem isn't that the company doesn't know. It's that they don't care. Every complaint is another form to fill out. Every fine is cheaper than fixing the problem." But some whistleblowers still refuse to give up. In 2015, a coalition of prison reform advocates began collecting testimonies under the campaign #FoodBehindBars, documenting hundreds of accounts from Ohio, Michigan, and Florida. The stories were horrifyingly consistent. Bread covered in mold. Chicken undercooked and pink inside. Food served on trays with roaches crawling across them. Water so dirty it smelled like rust. A Florida inmate's account read, "We had soup that was just water and salt. They called it nutritional broth. My stomach hurt every day. I started skipping meals to avoid getting sick." In response, Florida's Department of Corrections temporarily increased oversight, but within months the reports started again. The same companies. The same complaints. The same silence. The whistleblowers who tried to expose the system faced intimidation. One Ohio inmate who anonymously sent photos of rotten food to a journalist was later punished for unauthorized communication with the media. Another, who recorded video footage of maggots on a food tray, was transferred to a higher security facility. When asked about the punishment, a corrections spokesperson told reporters, "We do not comment on matters of inmate discipline." The official line was always the same: deny, deflect, and delay. But beneath the surface something was changing. The public outrage was growing. The photos were spreading online. For the first time, people were asking, if this is how we feed prisoners, what does that say about us? And yet, even as attention mounted, the corporations didn't back down. They had too much to lose, and too many friends in high places. The system's defenders argued it was all exaggerated, that prisoners were just complaining. But the photographic evidence, medical reports, and health inspection records said otherwise. For many inmates, the choice was cruelly simple. Eat what's given, or go hungry. Both hurt. Both humiliate. Both dehumanize. As one Michigan prisoner wrote to a local pastor, "They say we deserve punishment, but nobody deserves poison. Every meal is a reminder that they don't see us as people, just mouths they have to feed as cheaply as possible." By the time Ohio and Michigan's maggot scandals reached the evening news, the damage was already done. Photos had leaked. Lawsuits were filed. Activists were rallying. But instead of cutting ties with the corporations responsible, state officials scrambled to control the narrative and protect their lucrative contracts. When the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction first fined Aramark in 2014, officials assured the public that corrective measures were in place. Behind closed doors, internal emails told a different story. According to records later obtained by the Columbus Dispatch, some state administrators privately admitted that the company was overwhelmed, understaffed, and failing to meet minimum standards. Yet they continued to renew and expand the contract, because terminating it would create political and logistical chaos. In plain terms, firing Aramark was too embarrassing. The same logic played out in Michigan. When inspectors found maggots in multiple facilities, Governor Rick Snyder's administration downplayed the crisis. Press statements framed the incidents as isolated hygiene lapses. But internal memos, later revealed through FOIA requests, showed a much darker truth. Officials were fully aware of widespread contamination, undercooked food, and unreported staff misconduct. They simply chose not to escalate it. Why? Because undoing a $145 million, 3-year private food contract would mean admitting failure, both political and financial. According to the Detroit News, Aramark lobbyists were in frequent contact with Michigan's Department of Corrections leadership throughout the scandal. One email read, "We are working on a communication strategy to minimize further negative press. Cooperation will be critical." Another, sent just days after maggots were discovered in Jackson Prison, discussed protecting contractual interests before addressing sanitation. In other words, image first, inmates second. Even when fines were issued, they were quietly reduced or waived later. By 2015, Michigan's so-called penalties against Aramark, originally totaling more than $500,000, had been quietly cut by over 60% through negotiated settlements. The company kept its profits. The state kept its deniability. Meanwhile, inspectors who raised red flags found themselves reassigned or ignored. One Michigan corrections inspector told Vice, "We'd report violations and the higher-ups would tell us, 'Don't make it political.' Everything was political. Everything was about optics." In Florida, where Trinity Services Group took over from Aramark, similar tactics emerged. Health inspection reports documenting contaminated food were often marked resolved after a simple cleaning, even when deeper systemic issues persisted. Inmates continued to file grievances, but the system was built to make sure their words never left the prison walls. A 2016 analysis by the Miami Herald found that Florida's Department of Corrections had renewed Trinity's contract 5 times in a row, despite dozens of substantiated complaints of food contamination, falsified meal counts, and malnutrition. When pressed by reporters, state spokespersons insisted the system was under continuous improvement. In reality, it was under continuous protection. And the lobbyists made sure of it. Both Aramark and Trinity donated heavily to state political campaigns. They sponsored Correctional Association events, handed out scholarships, and funded staff appreciation days. It was a soft power strategy, one that blurred the line between contractor and policymaker. In Ohio, one of Aramark's regional consultants was a former corrections administrator. In Florida, another was a former deputy warden. The revolving door between public service and corporate profit spun seamlessly. By the time national attention faded, the system had fortified itself. Aramark simply shifted focus to other states and private prisons. Trinity expanded its contracts nationwide. And the headlines disappeared, just as intended. But for those inside, nothing changed. They still lined up every day for trays of gray meat and green hot dogs. They still ate in silence. They still got sick. The world had moved on. The inmates hadn't. As one Ohio prisoner wrote to a journalist after the scandal faded, The maggots are gone. But the hunger stayed. The cold meals stayed. The disrespect stayed. We're still here, eating their savings. Cruelty in prison isn't always loud. Sometimes it's served quietly on a tray. The maggots, the mold, the lies, they weren't accidents. They were business decisions. And the people who paid the price couldn't walk away. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit like, subscribe and share this video. Because silence protects corruption. Awareness destroys it. This is a factual, research-based documentary. All information comes from verified reports and credible sources, including the Columbus Dispatch, Detroit Free Press, the Marshall Project, and Vice News.